Welcome back to Legal Principles of Surveying, Spring 2014 Online. My name is Chris Riles, and I am your instructor from East Central Community College in Decatur, Mississippi. Today we're going to talk about sectionalized, the General Land Office land creation, okay? And this is all out of Brown's Boundary Control and Legal Principles. This is out of Chapter 6. Now, Chapter 6 is very, very rich with information about the history of our country, and I would really recommend that you read the whole chapter. There's some information that we'll get into that's not in the book in this lecture, but most of what we have here is in the book. But there's so much more information that you could get into. So I really think it would be beneficial if you would read the chapter, kind of take some notes on it, and I'm going to set up a discussion board so we can discuss some of the things that went on with this. So anyway, so we'll start where we left off in the very first set of lectures, where we talked about the history in America, colonial America, of surveying and land. And we're going to start here with the end of the Revolutionary War and the Second Treaty of Paris. Now, colonial America claimed her independence from Great Britain with the victory in the American Revolutionary War in 1783. What ended the war was the Second Treaty of Paris, and millions of acres of the land east of the Mississippi River immediately became the territory of colonial America. Lands west and lands south, there were some debates on who got what, but essentially the Spanish got the West Florida region to help us for paying off the debt that we had to them from the Revolutionary War, but we still had a lot of money that we had to come up with to pay off the debt for the Revolutionary War. The deal was they thought if we could take some of this land that we have now acquired and we could sell this land to private owners, we could recoup some of the debt. And they wanted to sell the land, but they needed to come up with a method by which the land could be sold quickly, easily, and it wouldn't involve so much input from a local surveyor, because most local surveyors use the antiquated meets and bounds system, which we talked about last week. And there were problems with the meets and bounds system. There were issues with retracements and going along behind the surveys and following those footsteps. And so this really caused a lot of stress and strife between the federal government and the local governments. And so what the Second Continental Congress, this is of course before we had a president, decided to do is they set up a committee in 1784 headed by Thomas Jefferson to set the stage for a system of rectangular surveys that would be used to survey the newly acquired territory. The Second Continental Congress was determined to develop this way to measure the lands in what would later become Ohio. They called it the Northwest Territory. And while Jefferson was serving as an ambassador in France, the Continental Congress decided to adopt some of the changes to Jefferson's proposal, and from that they then passed the Land Act of 1785. Now, this Land Act changed everything on how boundaries were to be created for the future of the United States, both states and counties. These are the principles of sectionalized lands. You've got 1 through 4 there, and 5 and 6. So we'll talk about all of them. Sectionalized lands, principle number 1. Principle 1, the approved original survey does not ascertain boundaries, rather it creates them. An original monument is one that was created, identified, called, and recovered on an approved original survey. Now, remember back that the original survey creates and defines boundaries when no boundaries currently exist. When they came along behind the pioneers and started laying out these boundaries, this was before anyone lived here. This was before anyone was moving here and pioneering in this direction. And so this is done where there was no ownership. Now, this distinguishes the retracement from the original, whereas retracements are always conducted on previously surveyed land, and they do ascertain boundaries. Because remember, that's what we do as surveyors. We ascertain boundaries. Where are they? Changes to these original surveys could be conducted by federal surveyors, but they had to do it before they issued a land patent. A land patent is a document from the federal government that basically states that a private owner has purchased the land from the government, and that patent is then as good as a deed from the federal government. It's been upheld by Kittredge versus Landry that the changes must be made before the patent grants and rights to that land. You can Google search Kittredge versus Landry. It's a pretty good case to read. Remember that any changes to boundaries, original or retracement, would cause a ripple effect of changes throughout the area. Even though there might be errors in an original survey, if you change one corner of an original survey, well, you would ripple effect change people's land, and it would just cause all kinds of issues. So, the original survey, remember, does not ascertain boundaries, rather, it creates them. Now, a little bit about original monuments. Original monuments are elusive in early surveyed states like Mississippi. However, as changes were made to the law, rules on what could be used as a monument was developed. Many monuments in Mississippi were made from turpentine pine knots. Now, the problem with this was, as a pioneer would come through and they wanted to farm land or have some pasture land, they would cut trees down and they would burn the land to remove this unwanted vegetation and shrubs. Well, as a result, they didn't last real long. The turpentine pine knots would light on fire and burn like gasoline, and there was nothing left. So a lot of monuments were lost. Now, monuments can be reset, but they must be reset according to the federal standards of law. Now, the BLM has a manual explaining these standards, Restoration of Lost Corners, and the last edition was 2009, and the most recent edition, the Manual of Surveying Instructions. And so you can use those instructions as a private surveyor to relocate the original monumentation and reset it. Principle 2, the lines and corners of an original survey control the location of a parcel. These lines are presumed to have been established in accordance with law, the special instructions, and the manual enforced as the date of the original survey work and the date of the signature of the plat. Now, there have been several editions of instructions and the manual over the years since 1785. Really, before 1855, there was no edition. It was just instructions. And so the first manual was printed in 1855. It was a reprint of what we call the Oregon instructions from 1851. Before this time, there was just instructions from geographers, surveyor generals, legislature. There really wasn't an individual who was in the field that actually saw the best way to survey these things that could communicate it then to the public. So if you're surveying one of these early districts, including Mississippi, sadly, you'll need to understand the specific instructions from that region, okay? Now, it's important that the person who attempts to find the footsteps of the original surveyors uses these footsteps. They're not just defined by actions, but by laws under which these actions are authorized. As a surveyor, you need to understand the rules and regulations at the time of original survey. We know here in Mississippi that the region that we are in, central part of Mississippi, was surveyed under the instruction of a man named Gideon Fitz, and he has special instructions from 1833 that he put forth and said, these are my instructions, and I have told the surveyors in Mississippi and the Mississippi Territory to survey according to these instructions. You need to know this, okay? Instructions were sent to the surveyors in Mississippi by this man, and so you need to know his instructions. You need to become familiar with them, and I'll tell you how to get a copy of that book here in the lecture. Principle 3, special instructions or manuals instructed the original surveyors on how to survey land, then courts interpret the laws, and how patented parcels of the land should be resurveyed or retraced. Remember, the making of original surveys is strictly controlled by the legislative body. It's an original, which means the government is in charge of it. Surveys conducted by original surveyors are considered once again to be unchangeable by law. These surveys were created by different kinds of instructions throughout different times of history. We talked about that. But any resurvey, which is conducted only by federal surveyors, or retracement, which could be by private surveyors, must be performed with the original method of survey in mind. You have to think about that. This results in deep research at the local level. It's really important that you know who surveyed the land that you're working on originally. What were their methodologies? How did they lay out a section? How did they lay out a township? And then we can come to an agreement and an understanding then on what to do with the land. And it's also important to not just research the methods, but also the laws that have passed behind it, the court cases that have gone beyond. Any kind of evidence like that you can find is very, very important. Principle 4, to practice in today's modern technical world, the surveyor must have an intimate knowledge of the historic legislation that created the public land survey system. Now, throughout the textbook, and we're going to talk about some of these, many of the major surveying acts and laws have been mentioned, and I really encourage you to just take a moment, breathe, and read it. It's very important. Because all other surveys are based off a retracement of the original, then we must have a deep, intimate knowledge, once again I go with that deep word, of those same portions of legislation. You need to be able to understand what happened with the Land Ordinance of 1785, and then what happened with the Act of 1805. Throughout the history of surveying, many methods were deemed errant or incorrect And legislation was made to solve these problems, but in that, maybe some other problems were created and then found. If you're surveying in a portion of the country that were affected by these errant methodologies, then your approach to surveying with modern technology must be based in where the errors and problems occurred. For instance, I know that in this region, especially where I am here in Newton County, Mississippi, that the surveys, all the error was pushed to the northeast corner of the township, which means that the sections running along the north and the eastern side of the township are going to be the closing sections, and those closing sections are going to have a lot of error in them. But the Manual of Surveying Instructions today talks about it being in the north and the west. Well, the reason it was different is because in this location, Gideon Fitz sent specific instructions out to his surveyors to survey it that way. You can see it on topographical maps. You can see it on county maps. How the sections are shifted, and even in some places near the Little Rock area, how they are just completely shifted. And it looks like you just took a bowl of water and poured it over the map, and it just kind of melted. It's really weird looking, but you got to understand those things when you survey in those kinds of areas. Now, this is a list of the early acts pertaining to the PLSS. There's a lot of information in your book about these acts, and this is about as far as your book goes. It starts with the Land Act of May 20th, 1785. That's the original act setting up the PLSS. Now, there were a lot of problems that were played with it. Originally, they didn't say how long the chain had to be. Now, we all know that a gunner's chain is 66 feet, but some surveyors used a 33-foot chain, and they all called them chains. Well, if I've got a line I survey with a 33-foot, and you got a line you survey with a 66-foot, and we both said that we went 100 chains, one of us is half as much as the other. Causes problems. So, 1796, they set forth the idea of chains mean this. Also in May 18th, 1796, they actually set forward the fact that lands were to be surveyed and returned prior to conveyance. I couldn't survey it and then give it to somebody. It had to be returned to the government and then had to be fixed. Land Act of May 1st, 1800, 1800 and May 10th, 1804, 1805. You can read these in your book. These are all in your book. I would recommend that you read them. But some of the acts after 1805. Now, some of this information I get directly out of the Manual of Surveying Instructions, 2009. For instance, the Act of April 25th, 1812, it created the GLO as a bureau within the Department of Treasury. So this is actually where the GLO started in 1812. And that's when they started, and this was immediately after the War of 1812, and we're now acquiring lands in Florida. So that's a pretty big deal. The Act states that the Secretary of the Interior, or such officers the Secretary may designate, shall perform all executive duties appertaining to the surveying and sale of public lands of the United States. So this kind of set forth that system of surveying for the GLO. We then march forward through 1820. Basically, it talked about the corners and the contents of half and quarter sections. Talked about how they could be sold fractionally, and these principles were prescribed later on previously from the February 1805 Act. In 1849, it created the Department of the Interior. This is important to note. And this act transferred the GLO to that new department and authorized the Secretary of the Interior to perform all the duties that the GLO was discharged to do. Excuse me. 1853, basically it provided the public survey should extend over all mineral lands and subdividing surveyed lands into lots less than 160 acres. So it had to be less than a quarter of a section. 1853, that's the one we just read. 1864, provided whenever it becomes necessary to survey Indian or other reservations to any lands, the same shall be surveyed under the direction and control of the BLM, and as nearly as may be in conformity to the rules and regulations under which other public lands were surveyed. Now, this is the point in which we see directly that this change is now changing the way things are done, and instructions are being set forth, because remember in 1855 was the first set of instructions. Now, if I remember correctly, in 1897 we acquired the Alaska Territory from Russia. We purchased it from in 1897. In 1899, 2 years later, we extended the PLSS to that territory. We decided, yeah, we need to survey that too. Land Acts continued through 1909, and if you look, 1910, 1918, the next most important is the Act of July 16th, 1946, which took the GLO, the General Land Office, abolished it, and called it now the Bureau of Land Management. This also included the some of the more biological sides of land management and just called it Bureau of Land Management. Then there was also an act in 1992. Let me flip the page here and look at 1992. Noted that appropriations therein made to the BLM in the fiscal year 1993 and thereafter may be expended for surveys of federal lands on a reimbursable basis for the survey of federal lands. So basically, the Act of 1992 allowed appropriations for the BLM to be able to survey public lands. Basically, we're going to create funding so that we can survey these lands. Now, all this information can be obtained from the 2009 Manual of Surveying Instructions. The older manuals can be found at this link, and this is on the GLO's website. I really recommend that you go out and look at this website. This link in particular gives you all the surveying manuals from 1855 to 1973. I'm telling you guys, this is a place where you can get a whole lot of information, more than these books the book that you've purchased here for this course can give you. Now, the newest edition can be purchased for about, I think it's $120. It's Manual of Surveying Instructions 2009. But I would recommend you kind of flip through the 1973, which was the latest and greatest until this one, the latest one was released. Okay. Now back to the principles. Principle number 5. There can be only one original survey. Once again, we find this terminology about it. Any other survey of original survey is a retracement and cannot alter the original corners or rights or section lines. This original survey, remember, it creates boundaries. And this is a survey conducted before any other and is the foundation on which all surveys are based. Now, in Mississippi, original surveys were conducted based on changing and varied methods of instruction, crude instrumentation. So we're going to have problems. But however, if we try to correct these errors, would create such a ripple effect on the boundaries and the rights of all landowners that people would go nuts. It would cause serious issues. It's important that you recognize your role in surveying and that your role is to identify evidence of boundaries as they pertain to the original surveys. Not to give legal advice or to do anything of the sort. Principle 6. A surveyor who conducts retracements of the GLO or the PLSS boundaries should be acquainted with historic and current court decisions. Now, we're going to get into court decisions when we talk about the semester paper assignment, which I'm going to give you here in about another week. And I want to try to start it this week, but I just don't know that we're going to get to it. It's important that you read and research court cases and look at precedent court cases on the subject. Now, I remind you out of your book, this is not a legal textbook. Your book says this, nor was it designed as such. It's just a guide, okay? The author makes it quite clear that this book is not intended to be used as a law book, but rather as a reference to the conduct of surveys. It's not legally binding. Local, state, and federal court cases are what you go to if you're looking for legal issues. So let's say that I'm dealing with, and we've used this term before, eminent domain in Mississippi. Well, I want to go to the Mississippi Code, and then I want to look for court cases in Mississippi that deal with eminent domain. It's important that we look at it from this standpoint as surveyors, that we're not supposed to know the law, or practice law rather, but we're supposed to know the body of the law and understand the basics behind the law that we are looking at. Now, anyone who wants to seek books on how lands were surveyed in Mississippi in the past, they should visit this website, www.mississippisurveyor.com/books.htm. This page will give you a link where you can print off a order booklet, or order page rather, for the booklets that talk about the history of surveying in Mississippi. Now, this has helped me understand a lot, both professionally and personally, about the complexities of surveying in Mississippi. Now, you're not required to purchase these for this course, but I know several of you are taking this course because you plan on becoming a professional one day. Well, if you want to take your professional surveying exam in the state of Mississippi, you will have to purchase these books and study them. I mean, it's one of those things that you just need to do. If you got $50, buy all three. If you only have 20, buy the two $10 books, okay? I mean, it's really important, and I'm telling you, my copies, I have written in them, and I have done research in them, and I have just used them for not just teaching, but also personal enrichment of the understanding of our state and how our state was surveyed. A lot of questions that you have pertaining to original surveys in Mississippi can be understood better by reading these books and having a copy of these books. This week we're going to have a quiz 5 on chapters 5 and 6 slides. Remember that we're going to go back to chapter 5 some. We're going to have some quizzes together. Check the assignments tab for the semester paper assignment. I haven't quite got it all set up yet, so we're going to be working on it, but just be thinking about it. I will post when I put the semester paper assignment up. But you're basically going to be reading some court cases, and then you're going to give me a brief synopsis of the case. So anyway, hope you have a great week. Hope everything works out for you. If I can help you in any way, please let me know, and hope you enjoyed the video. Talk to you next time.